Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on building out our monster detail scene, and we connected this to our monster party scene. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to source code up to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so now we've set up our initial monster party and monster detail scene. What we need to do now is we need to connect this to our in-game menu, and then that way we can actually access this scene from our world scene. And then once we do that, we'll need to work on how we're passing data between our scenes when they start. So then that way we can add in our functionality that we discussed before for like our monster details scene, knowing which monster was selected, and in our monster party scene, knowing which scene we came from. So to get started with these changes, let's jump over to our preload scene, and we're going to jump right into our world scene when our game starts. And then what we'll do is let's go into our menu class for our world scene. And what we want to do is we'll come into our constructor where we define our available menu options. And what we'll do is let's add in our menu option for monsters. So when we do that in our scene, what we should see if we open our menu, we should see the monsters option available now. And then what we need to do is we need to process that input. So if we come to our world scene, we'll need to come down to our update method where we're handling our various menu options. And so currently we're only handling save and exit. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to break this up a little bit, and I'm just going to do an if statement for exit. And then what we'll do is let's copy this, and we're going to go ahead and change this to monsters. All right, so instead of hiding our menu, what we want to do when we select our monsters option is we want to go ahead and launch our monster party scene, but we don't actually want to stop our world scene. And so the reason for that is we want this to kind of be like an in-game pause menu. And what should happen is like we should actually pause our game when this happens. And so our NPCs would remain where they are, our player would remain where they are. And when we come back to our scene here, our menu would still be open if we want to back out. So far we've only been running one scene at a time, but Phaser does allow you to run multiple scenes in parallel. And to do that, what you can do is you can use the launch method on your scene class to go ahead and launch another scene. Or when your scene starts up, in your constructor, you have the ability to say, hey, I want this scene to start right away. And so because we don't want our monster party scene running at all times, we're going to go ahead and use the launch method to go ahead and start that scene. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is let's get rid of this line of code here. And we're going to do this, and we'll do our scene to reference our scene manager, and we're going to use the launch method to start another scene. And then for our scene, we'll use our scene keys, and we're going to go ahead and reference our monster party scene. So now what should happen is if we open our menu and we click on monsters, we'll see right away that our new scene is launched. And because we're using the same coordinates for our camera, it kind of gets overlaid our existing scene. And due to this, it's also kind of transparent because when we did that scene, we made our main background a little bit opaque. And so we'll need to go ahead and address that. But what we can see is behind it, we can see our other scenes still running. And now when we process our input, we're updating both of our scenes at the same time. And that's not what we want. Instead, we actually want our world scene to be paused. And to do that, all we need to do is do this, reference our current scene, and use the pause method, and that's going to pause our world scene. So now if we go ahead and open up our monster party scene, we can see our NPC no longer moves, and when we handle our input, it's only tied to the currently active scene, and we're not processing that in our other scene. So to go ahead and fix our transparent background issue, what we'll do is let's come over to our monster party scene, and let's go to the top of our create method. So right before we create our background image, what we'll do is we're just going to add a background to this scene, and then that way our world scene won't be visible at all. So right before we add in our background, what we'll do is we'll do this .add, and we're just going to use our rectangle game object. And so for this, we're going to position it at 0, 0, so it's the top left corner. And we want this to take our whole width and height of our game. And so we're just going to do this. We'll use our scale manager. We'll grab the width, and we'll grab our height. And then we need to use our color. And so we're just going to do black. And we'll set our alpha to make sure it's 1, so it's not transparent at all. And we need to make sure we put our origin in the top left-hand corner. All right, so if we go ahead and test our changes, if we open up our menu, go to our monster party scene, now our scene is visible and we don't see our world scene beneath it. So now we fix that issue, what we need to do next is we need to figure out how we can pass data from our world scene to our monster party scene. And so currently our monster party scene is set up with a method to have us go back to our previous scene. And the reason for that was because we can get to this scene from both our world scene and from our battle scene. And so we'll need to know which scene we need to actually go back to, because currently we're hard-coded to go back to our world scene. In addition to that, what we need to do is, because we're pausing our world scene, we don't want to actually use the start method. Instead, we want to use the resume method to resume the scene that we previously paused. And then we would want to stop our monster party scene when we go back to that previous scene. And so this is actually pretty easy to do in Phaser. If we jump over to our world scene, when we start our monster party scene, when we launch a scene or when we call the start method, one of the things we can pass when we call these method is a data object. And basically this allows us to pass any data we want to a scene when our scene is initialized or resumed. And when we do this, we can pass any data we want. And so this is a perfect place for us to go ahead and pass in the scene that we're coming from. All right, so to see an example of this, what we'll do is right above, before we call our launch method, we'll make a new object. And we're just going to call this scene data to pass. And we'll set this equal to an object. And on this object, we'll add in a key. We're just going to call this previous scene name. And we're going to set it equal to our scene keys. And we'll set it equal to our world scene. So then, when we call our launch method, let's go ahead and pass that in. And now if we come back to our monster party scene, what we should be able to do is in our init method, we should be able to see the data that's being passed. So we come up to our init method, let's add in a parameter for data. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're just going to do console.log, and we'll do data. So now if we come back to our scene, if we hit the enter key and let's go into our monster party scene, we'll see right away after our init method's invoked, we see a new console log. And with that, that's our object that has our data that we pass to our scene. And so by using this method, we can easily pass data when we first start our scenes. And you can also do this when you want to resume a scene. So what we're going to go ahead and do is if we come down to our method for going back to our previous scene, we're just going to go ahead and let's copy that logic we did here. We'll come back to our monster party scene and we'll add that in. And let's just go ahead and try passing that data. And what we'll want to do is instead of starting our scene, we need to go ahead and use the resume method. And we'll go ahead and stop our current scene. So we'll do this, we'll reference our scene manager, we'll call stop. And we're going to go ahead and pass in our monster party scene key name. So we'll stop this current scene. So now what will happen is in our scene, if we hit our enter key, let's go into our menu, go into monster party. If we go back, we'll see now we're taken right back to our world scene. However, we don't see a console log statement. And the reason for that is when you resume your scene's already initialized, so it's not going to call that init method. Instead, we need to add an event listener for when our scene is actually resumed, and then that way we can handle it appropriately. All right, so to go ahead and add this event listener, what we'll do is let's jump back to our world scene. And what we'll do is we'll come up to the bottom of our create method. So right after we create our menu, we'll go ahead and add our event listener. And so for this event listener, what we want to do is we'll reference our events on our scene. And we'll want to use the on method so we can listen for this event. And so we'll do phaser.scenes.events. And we're going to use the resume event. And so this event is going to be fired by Phaser once your scene starts back up when we use that resume method. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to make a new method, and we're just going to call this handle resume. And we'll pass in this for our context, so that way it's provided when that method's called. So now if you come down to the bottom of our scene, let's go ahead and add in that private method. And what I'm going to go ahead and do, I'm just going to add a console log statement. And so we're just going to do console.log, and we'll reference our scene name. And so we're just going to go ahead and do world scene.name. And then we'll have our method name. So we're just going to do handle resume. And then we'll say scene has been resumed. And then what we should be able to do is now if we go ahead and test and we come back to our world scene, we should see our new log statement be called. So when you register your event listener for the resume event, when Phaser calls your callback, it's going to provide 2 arguments. And the first one is going to be the system, so the Phaser's scene system of the scene that resumed this scene. And then that way, if you need any references to it, to know what scene called it, you can access it from that. So then your second argument is going to be your data. And so this is going to be like the data that's passed to our init method. And so this should have any data that we want to pass when our scene restarts. So what we should be able to do is I'm just going to do a console log, and I'm going to go ahead and log out both of these items. And if we go ahead and save, if we go into our menu, what we should see is after we go back to our world scene, we'll see our log line, and then we see our other log line with our 2 objects. And so for our first one, we'll see our systems manager for that scene, and then we'll see our data that we pass back to our world scene. Alright, so now that we've seen how we can pass data between our scenes when they start and when we pause and resume them, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to move some of this logic over to our base scene because we'll need it in multiple spots. So we're going to need some of this logic both in our world scene, our monster details, and our monster party scene, since we'll be transitioning between them. And then also later on, we'll also need it in our battle scene when we connect our scenes there as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy our logic here for handle resume, and we'll come to our base scene. And what we'll do is we'll add in a new public method, and we're going to call it handle resume, and we'll just change the handle scene resume. And then what we'll do is we're just going to update our log. So we're just going to copy this. We're going to go ahead and paste this, and we'll change this to handle scene resume. And then one last thing we're going to do is we're going to check to see if data is actually passed. Because data is going to be optional, we want to go ahead and log it if it's provided. If it's not provided, we won't log it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add an if statement. So if data exists, then we'll have a slightly different log line. So we'll go ahead and do this. And we're just going to say data provided. And we're just going to JSON stringify that. And we'll go ahead and use our data. So then that way if we have our data, we'll go ahead and log it. And then we'll go ahead and return. Otherwise, we'll just use our other log message. So then we're just going to say invoked. And then so what we'll do is we're also going to do the same thing up in our init method. So if we come up to init, one of the things we can expect now is data. And we're also going to do a similar thing with our log lines. We're going to do if data. We'll log a different line. Otherwise, we'll just log our basic line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that line that we added. Then we don't have to retype it. So then we'll just go ahead and change that. Alright, so with our changes, we should be able to modify our world scene. So let's come back to our world scene. Let's get rid of our handle resume method, and we'll come up to our event handler. And what we'll do is we're just going to go ahead and reference our handle scene resume. So we'll have this, and we'll have handle scene resume on our parent class. And one minor change we're going to do is when we resume our scene, we're going to go ahead and unlock our controls just in case they're already locked. So we'll go ahead and reference our controls, and we'll set is input locked, and we'll set it equal to false. All right, and so by doing that, that way now after our scenes are resumed and we're done with our transitions, we'll unlock our input. So in a lot of our scenes, what we've seen is when we start that transition, we go ahead and lock it, and then that way we don't accidentally modify it. So now what we'll go ahead and do is let's come back to our monster party scene, and let's get rid of our console log statement for our init method. And what we should be able to see is now if we come back to our scene, let's go into our party scene, and we don't see our data. Yes, we actually need to pass it to our init method. So if we go ahead and pass in data, and now we retest, we should see the data that we provided as part of our log line. And if we come back to our world scene, we should see our handle scene resume is being invoked still. With our logic in place for passing data between our scenes, what we need to do now is in our monster party scene, we actually need to handle that data. And so when we call our init method, we're receiving the data with our previous scene, but what we need to do is we need to store a reference to that. So then that way down in our method for returning to our previous scene, we can go ahead and reference that data. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to add a new property to our class. So what we'll do is we'll come up to our constructor, and we're going to call this scene data. And so for our scene data, we're just going to go ahead and set the data that's provided to that property. And so we're going to go ahead and we'll do this. We'll do our scene data and we'll set equal to data. So then what we should be able to do is we come down to our method for where we go back to our previous scene. Instead of having our hard-coded world scene, what we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to go ahead and change this to this scene data. And we're going to go ahead and reference our property. And so this is going to be our previous scene name. And then what I'm going to do is I want to clean up our scene data that we're passing here on resume, because we don't actually need to pass that to our world scene. But later on, once we connect our inventory and our monster party scene, we'll need some of that data. So now if we want to go ahead and test our changes, what we should be able to do is if we go ahead and go into our monster party scene, and if we go ahead and hit the shift key, we come back to our world scene. And then likewise, if we go ahead and hit the cancel button, we also come back to our world scene. So now we have our data passing to our monster party scene working. We need to do the same thing in our monster details scene. However, instead of receiving a scene, we want to receive which monster we currently selected in our monster party scene. So to go ahead and do this, let's come down to our update method where we listen for our input. And we'll go ahead and start our scene for our monster details. What we'll do is we'll use our currently selected monster's index to grab our monster data, and we'll go ahead and pass that. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of our comment, and then we're going to go ahead and do const scene data to pass, and we'll set that equal to an object, and we'll pass in one property called monster. And on here, we're going to set it equal to this. We'll grab our monsters array, and then we'll have this, and we'll have our selected monster party index. So we have that monster. And then what we'll do is when we, instead of starting that scene, we're going to go ahead and launch it. And so we'll have our monster party scene, and we're also going to pass in scene data to pass. And then that way we'll go ahead and pause our monster party scene, and then we'll go ahead and also launch our other scene. Then that way we can stop our monster detail scene when we're done and come back to this scene here and have it resume. So then what we need to do is we need to pause this scene. That way we don't process our input at the same time. And so we'll have our scene keys. And we're going to have our monster party scene. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lock our input. I'm going to place that above our scene data to pass. That way it's just grouped together. So now if we come back to our monster details scene, let's come up to our init method. Let's add in data, and we'll pass that to our init method. So if we want to go ahead and test, if we go ahead and go into our menu, if we go ahead and select our monster, we'll see right now, as soon as our monster detail scene, the init method's invoked, we have all of our monster details, and now we can use that in our scene. So what we can do is we can just update our monster details to reference our monster on our data object here. But instead of removing this altogether, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this in an if statement. And then that way, if we just want to test this scene by itself, we can just go ahead and grab the data from our data manager. So if we start this scene directly from our preload scene, we don't want to have to keep passing in our data there. Instead, we'll just have this fallback here for testing purposes. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is right after we get our data, we'll say that monster details is going to be equal to our data and then our monster property on it that we passed in. And then we're just going to have a safety check, and we're just going to say if our monster details is equal to undefined. So if we started this scene from the preload scene, we can still override that data. So then what we should be able to do is if we want to go ahead and test, we'll go into our monsters. We'll go ahead and select our monster. Our details still work. And for example, if we come to our preload scene, let's jump right into our monster detail scene. And we should still see our iguana knight because we're still grabbing that data there as a fallback. And so this is just a nice way to have that data there. So like as we're working in the scene, we don't have to keep going through multiple scenes to get that data. All right, so one more change we need to make to our monster details scene is when we go back to our previous scene, we're using the start method. Let's go ahead and change this to resume. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to stop our current scene. So we'll reference our scene and we'll use the stop method. And let's go ahead and pass in our scene keys with our monster detail scene. So now we should be able to test this end to end. So if we go into our menu, if we go ahead and select our iguana knight, what we should see now is we see our monster details scene. And if we hit the space key, we exit. and we come back into our monster detail scene. However, one issue we have is our input is locked, and so we're not actually handling our scene resume event like we did in our world scene. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is let's come over to our world scene where we register our event listener. And instead of having to do this in each scene, we're just going to pass this to our base class, and then that way our scenes have it available to us. So let's go ahead and jump over to our base scene. And what we'll do is let's come up to our create method after we create our controls. We're going to go ahead and paste in that logic there for handling our scene resume event. So now all of our child scenes should have this event listener registered, and then it should call our method that we have here. So now back on our scene, let's go ahead and go into our menu. We'll go ahead and select our monster. And now if we go ahead and hit a button to go back, we can see our input is unlocked. And if we keep going back, we should be able to go back to our world scene without any issues. So one last thing we need to do before we wrap up is we need to go ahead and add in some logic to clean up our event listeners when our scenes are being shut down. So as we discussed before, it's best practice to clean up your event listeners when you're done with them, or when your objects are being destroyed, same thing with your scenes. Otherwise, what can happen is you can have multiple instances of them, and you can have unintended side effects in your game, and they can eat up resources. And so when we added in our draggable code before, in our tools section, we saw one way we could listen for the destroy event on game objects. Similar to this, your scenes have a shutdown event that we can listen to do this cleanup logic. So to see an example of what will happen if we don't clean up our events, is if we come to our scene, and if we go into our party scene, and we go into our monster details scene, and if we repeat this a few times, what will happen is we'll see that on our event listener for our handle scene resume, we're now invoking it multiple times every time we come back into our monster party scene. And what's happening is because we're using the stop method to stop and shut down this scene, when we start a new instance of it, when we launch it, we never cleaned up that original event listener, so another one is being added. And this process will just keep repeating as our game is running, and it'll just keep eating up resources. And so an easy fix for this is we just need to listen for that scene shutdown event, and we'll do our cleanup. So if we come into our base scene method, what we'll do is at the bottom of our create method, we're going to go ahead and add one more event we'll listen to. So let's grab our event emitter from our scene, and we'll use the once method, and we're going to listen to phaser, scenes, events, and now we want to listen for our shutdown event. And so we'll go ahead and call a new method, and we'll just call this, and we'll do handle scene cleanup, and we'll do this. And then what we'll do is let's add that method. So we'll add it down below our handle scene resume. And so what we want to do is when this method is invoked, we just want to turn off our event listener here that we registered. So we're going to go ahead and paste that in here, and we're going to use the off method to turn this off. And what we'll do is let's just add in our console log just so we have it. And we'll update our method name, and we'll go ahead and save. So now if we come back to our scene, if we want to go ahead and test, let's go into our monster party details, come back to our world scene, and we'll just repeat this process a few times. And what we should see now when we have our log line, we should see only one instance of our messages being logged. Likewise, if we take a look at our log lines, we should see our handle scene cleanup is being invoked, so it's cleaning up our event listeners on our scene. Alright, with that actually brings this video to an end, and that actually wraps up our monster party and monster detail scene section. So in our next video, we're going to start our inventory section, and what we'll do is we'll start building out a new scene for handling inventory in our game, and we'll start adding in functionality to allow the player to use items in our game. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.